Good morning, friends. Welcome back to the Say What podcast. My name is Hannah, and on this podcast, we like to talk about sex, purity culture, women, girly things. It's just a lot of fun over here on the podcast, and I'm so excited because we actually have a guest today. We have Dr. Camden Morgante. Welcome.
Thanks, Hannah. It's always so fun to get to chat with you.
Yes, we've actually had Camden on before. It's been a while, but we have been social media friends for a really long time. I would love to be able to meet in person someday, but we have been social media friends for a really long time. We are in the same space talking about purity culture, and you just wrote an incredible, incredible book. Like, as I was reading this book, my mouth just like kept dropping open. And I was also like, this is the book I feel like I would write. Like, we're so in sync with like our beliefs on things. And the way that your book challenged some of my thoughts as well was really good. It really opened my eyes to a lot of things. And like one of the things that really like challenged my thoughts was the soul ties chapter, which we will talk about, or the section, it wasn't a chapter, the section of the soul ties. I thought that was a really good conversation and it definitely challenged my beliefs, which I thought was really good because I want to read a book that challenges me. But it was just so good. I could literally sing its praises forever, which I will do throughout this podcast
Thank
because
you.
it really is. If you grew up in purity culture, which if you are listening to this podcast, you probably did, it is the book that so many of us, all of us really needed to read and need to read just to have a really, I think, healthy view of sex. It's just so good. So thank you so much for being so brave and writing about sex. And you're already brave talking about sex on the internet, but putting it in a book is so brave and so vulnerable. You shared so much of your story, which is so vulnerable. But just thank you. I just wanted to say from all of my corner of the internet people, thank you so much for writing this book.
Well, thank you for your support and enthusiasm. That means a lot from somebody who is like has the personal experience too reading this.
Yeah, as I was reading it, I think I messaged you one time. I was like, "This is so validating. Like everything I'm going through, I'm like, yep, I felt that. Yep, I felt that. I experienced that. I definitely played a part in that." Because I love too how you were like, while I was in purity culture, I definitely was like preaching purity culture to people, and I was like, "Yep, I definitely did that for sure, just as
Yeah.
much." But it's so good. I love the premise of your book, how you have the 5 myths, and we'll talk about those. But you talk about parenting after purity culture. You talk about sex education. You talk about singleness, which I think was such an important chapter to have. You really cover the whole gamut, I think, of women who are reading this book. I mean, men too, but women who are reading this book. I just think it is going to play such a role in them being able to overcome the purity culture thoughts and really, think about their sexuality for themselves and not just like what we were taught. So I just thought it was just so many good things. I kept highlighting throughout because I was like, this is so good, so good, so good.
Oh, good.
So let's just like dive right in. Before we get to the actual topics of the book, I want to know like what inspired you to write this book? Like, where did this come from? I know it, we talk a lot about it, your story in the book, but like what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, I think I always knew I wanted to write a book. It's kind of been a lifelong dream, as it is for many people. And what I wanted to write about changed over the years. But
Mm-hmm.
after I got married in 2016. The discourse about purity culture was starting to happen. Like, I think the first kind of critiques were coming out about it. And like you said, previously I'd been a huge believer in purity culture and was very proud of like waiting until marriage and things like that and saw it as a great thing.
Mm-hmm.
But then as I was reading people's critiques of it, I realized, wow, a lot of this had some unintended consequences that we just didn't know would happen. And I realized for myself that this crisis of faith that I went through in my 20s was largely due to purity culture.
Mm-hmm.
That I wouldn't have suffered so much in my faith if it hadn't been for the false promises of purity culture. So I saw it
Right.
in myself. And then I also started to recognize it in my clients. At the
Mm-hmm.
time, I was working at a college counseling center, and then I became a professor. So I was working, with my students at a Christian college. And so, they're all getting married really young and they're
Mm-hmm.
just super unprepared for marriage. And they're thinking sex is going to be amazing right away.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it isn't always like that. It isn't always
Right.
amazing right away. And it does take work. And preparation and communication and skills like
It's a
that that they
skill.
just
Yeah.
they just didn't have.
Right.
And so yeah, so starting to see like, here's how it affected my faith, here's how it is affecting other people's sexuality, and then here's how it's affecting their relationships,
Yeah.
creating a lot of inequality between men and women in relationships. Yeah, and a lot of tension in those relationships when it comes to sex. And then also our relationship to ourselves, like women's body image in particular, with
Yes.
modesty culture and just our feelings of being connected to ourselves and our body.
Hmm.
Yeah, so those three areas, sexuality, faith, and relationships, are the ones that I see most affected by purity culture. And all of that started helping me start thinking about this could be a book.
Yeah.
And then I came up with the myths, the five
Yes.
myths of purity culture. Wrote an article in 2018 that was published in 19 and won a writing contest. And that forms the basis of the second
Yeah.
section of the book.
Yeah, I thought it was so cool. I was reading your email that you sent out this morning talking about the how you wrote this in 2018. And I was like, that's so cool that like years ago this like idea was born. I mean like kind of your whole life, but like the idea was born here and now it's like turned into this book like all these years later. I just think is so cool. I think that's awesome. And I think
Yeah,
your
it's really,
background being like a doctor and being
yeah.
in school and teaching and having clients and just hearing from all these people, you're like, okay, this is a felt need and I feel like I could write it and meet it. And you 100% did.
Yeah, it's really evolved over the years too, as my own faith has evolved
Hmm.
and as my work has evolved. I started coaching for purity culture recovery in 2021, and that gave me a different perspective too, because I was working one on one with women and couples very, very directly, very
Hmm.
focused on this one issue. And so I started to hear more of the stories and more of what they needed. And
Yeah,
that really refined the idea for my book and took it in the direction of people really need healing.
right.
There's so many good resources on like critiquing purity culture and what the
Hmm.
problems with it are. There's great research like from Sheila Gregoire and The Great Sex
Yes.
Rescue, and there's personal memoirs and stories and people's, their own journey, which is
Hmm.
so helpful to read. But what we're missing is, how do I take the next step? Like, I'm stuck. How do I
Right.
start healing from this and rebuild from this? And that's where I
Totally.
felt like I had a unique voice to give to that, like to give to that topic, because of being a psychologist and having the
Yes.
personal experience too.
Right. And I love that at the end of all the chapters, you have like practical application, which I think is where the healing part comes in. Because you're like, okay, we talked about all this, but now we actually have to do things to like work towards healing. You know, talking about it is great and reading about it is great, but we need to take some actionable steps to experience healing. And I love that all the different tools that you have in the book to just like do kind of reflection of the chapter and also working with your spouse on things. I just think it's like really great. I thought those practical tools were so key to also setting your book apart from others. You know, I think that really makes a big difference and helps you actually go from point A to point B. Because I think there's a lot of times we read books and it's like, okay, I felt really good, but now like I don't know how to like what to do from here. Like that was great, but like I need some help to like kind of move forward. And that's what those tools definitely did. So I think
Right.
it was so great that you included all those at the end of every chapter. I thought it was so awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted that to be unique in setting my book
Mhm.
apart, because it's kind of like a book and a workbook in one,
Yes, yeah, yeah.
rather than having to buy two. And
Right.
also, like, I wanted it to feel like some coaching sessions with me, because these are
Mhm.
exercises that are drawn from evidence-based therapy
Mhm.
interventions and techniques. Like they're not a couple of them maybe I kind of adapted or kind of came up with, but most
Mhm.
of them are drawn from therapy and
Totally.
just applied to purity culture. And so I wanted
Yeah.
it to feel like, for people who can't afford therapy or just can't
Mhm.
access that resource, here is a resource for, $15 or something like that on Amazon,
Absolutely.
where people can get a lot of help out of it.
Absolutely. Well, let's just dive in. Let's talk about the five myths of purity culture, and if you could just kind of go through those with like kind of overview, and we can kind of talk about. It. I think that'd be really great. I think it's a good starting point.
Okay. Yeah, so the first myth is the spiritual barometer myth. This teaching that we are better Christians and more spiritually mature if we are virgins, really
Yep.
equating our spirituality with our virginity, like making those two things like intertwined.
100%.
Yeah, I
Yep.
know we both related a lot to that,
Yes.
and that myth causes a lot of pride, just like
Hmm.
sinful pride, and also judgmentalism of others.
Hmm.
So I found that one, affecting me, and could relate to that one. The
Yes.
second is the fairy tale myth. This false promise that if you are
Yep.
pure, you're going to have a fairy tale marriage and a
Mhm.
family and never get your heart broken. And that was
Yep.
the one that affected me personally the most
Yeah.
because I thought I was going to marry my first love in college, and
Right.
we dated for almost 3 years, and I really thought he was the one. And then when he broke up with me, I was devastated and
Yeah.
crushed, but also my faith was devastated
Right.
because it was like, well, why have I been, following all these rules and being a good girl and doing the right thing if,
Hmm.
I'm not going to get this reward that I was told I was going to get.
Right. Right.
So that's the fairy tale myth. The next one is the flipped switch myth. The
Hmm.
idea that once you get married, you flip a switch and sex is going to be amazing and easy right
Yep.
away. And I
Y'all know I
know,
talk about that all the time on
yes,
this podcast.
you did
Yes.
not experience that. And I actually
Nope.
interviewed you for that chapter and include a little bit of
Yes.
your story in there, some
Yes, I
quotes
was
from
very
you.
honored to be a part of this book. And even if I
Yeah.
wasn't, I would have 100% been on board. But it's so cool to like have a little bit of my story get to be in your book. It truly was an honor when you asked me to do that. So thank
Oh,
you.
yeah. I bet it's cool to just see your name, to
It
see
is.
your
No, I
quotes.
it is. I like got the book and I was like, oh, where am I at? And it like searched my name. And I was like, okay,
Yeah.
I'm at chapter five. I'll get to chapter five when I think it's chapter five. I think. Yeah. I
Yeah.
was like, I'll get there when it comes. But that was selfishly kind of cool.
That
Not
is,
gonna lie.
yeah.
It was cool.
Yeah, and I appreciated you sharing that because I wanted to show the disappointment that can come when sex
Mm,
doesn't turn out the way you expected and how it makes you feel like something's wrong with your body.
totally.
Um, yeah, so the fourth myth is the gatekeeper's myth. This is the one that really pits women and men against each other, that women are
Yes.
the gatekeepers of sexuality, both before marriage, putting on the brakes and setting boundaries, and then after marriage, having to meet their husband's sexual needs, and that's what they're
Hmm.
told. And this one hurts both men and women because
Yeah.
of the inequality that it sets up. And then the last one is the damaged goods myth. This
Hmm.
is the myth that I say is perhaps the worst, the most
Yeah.
damaging overall, because it creates so much shame
Hmm.
for people who do have premarital sex or just even feel like they go too far, or especially for those who are sexually abused and feel like
Yes.
they are broken and damaged because of it. And that's
Right.
not biblical. That is not what
It's
Jesus
so
says
the
about
opposite.
us.
It's so
Yeah.
it has never made sense in my brain. I'm like, it literally is the exact opposite of what Jesus says. He says if you come to him and ask for forgiveness or, you can be made new and whole in Christ. And those who were sexually abused did not need to ask for forgiveness. That was not their choice. But like Jesus can still make them new, make them whole. Like that's the whole purpose of Jesus. So it's like, how can you be preaching these things when that's the entire purpose of Jesus? Doesn't make sense in my brain. I wanted to read some quotes that kind of stood out to me from these myths, because I was reading them and like kind of like made my jaw drop. When you were talking about the spiritual barometer myth, I loved what you said. You said the spiritual barometer myth taught us that, especially for women, our virginity or purity was the marker of our status as believers. Indeed, purity rings were almost exclusively marketed to females, and purity balls were solely for young girls and their fathers, the keepers of their virginity. And I just think it's so interesting about the father part of it. I've always like thought that part that kind of always stood out to me when it came to like the father piece of it is like the spirit the purity balls were often connected like father and daughter. And it's like where did that come from? That feels really weird. I guess it's like the dad is like the leader in their mind quote of the household and so therefore he's like the gatekeeper of her sexuality. I don't know, that part that is always so weird to me. I mean that's definitely a common thing. It's like dads and daughters doing that kind of stuff. But it was just always very interesting to me that that's like how that laid out. It just feels like kind of weird, you know?
Well, I think it just shows how purity culture is rooted in patriarchy. This idea
Mhm.
that men are the heads and the leaders, and women are subservient and
Yeah.
submissive and don't have a lot of agency on their own. Instead of being equals that work together, co-heirs of the kingdom and
Hmm.
co-laborers with Christ. Yeah, because it's like you need your father to be the keeper of your virginity.
Yeah.
When my dad and I talked about that, he was like, I never considered that. Like, this
Yeah.
is your choice. This was your choice. Like,
Right.
your body, like, your decisions.
Hmm.
This between you and God, and then you and your husband, not me.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
appreciated that.
Yeah, my dad, I've talked about I don't think my parents necessarily like taught me a lot of the purity culture stuff. Like my dad tried to talk to me about sex one time in the Sonic drive-through, and I was like, absolutely not. I'm just trying to get my cherry limeade. Like, do not speak to me about this right now. And then that was the end of that conversation. But I know it's so common, so I just like wanted to touch on that. But I really loved your line about like it was the marker of whether or not we were like saved or not. And that was 100% like how I believed. Like my identity was solely in my like status as a virgin. I mean, I would tell you back then, like, oh yeah, I'm a Christian, I love Jesus, whatever. But internally, I was like, okay, but if I do this, like, there's no way I'm still a Christian. Like, I can't be a Christian and go off and have premarital sex. Like, that's like, I can never be loved by God if I do that. Like, those were definitely so intertwined for me, 100%.
Yeah, I wrote that my entire faith was built on virginity,
Mm-hmm.
that I didn't think you could have one without the other, which is a very shallow and short-sighted view of faith. You know, there's so much
Yeah.
more to being a Christian. How we honor God with our bodies and the decisions we make with our bodies is just one part of that. It's not the whole part of our faith.
Right.
But that's what purity culture made it for me, which you can see how that leads to judgmentalism, because when you're seeing
Totally.
people who are having premarital sex, like I would be like, well, they must not be good Christians, or I'm
Yep.
better than them.
Yep.
And
Oh,
pride
I
is
was
not
so
a fruit of the
judgmental.
spirit.
No,
Yeah.
and that's I love what you said. Like you did say that was another quote that the fruit of the spiritual barometer myth is pride and judgment when we believe a lie that we are holier than thou because of our virginity. I'm like that's so good. I was like, yes, like the fruit of the spiritual barometer myth is totally pride and judgment. Like 100%. 100%. Because I definitely wore it like a badge of honor that I
Same.
quote saved myself until marriage when I definitely did so many other things to be clear. So I'm like, come on, like, was I not? I mean, I didn't do the actual act, but I was very much living that hypocritical kind of life. Very, very judgy.
Yeah, and I think the kernel of truth is that when we have an authentic relationship with God, that we want to honor him and respect him. And one of those ways that we do that could be through our sexual choices and the ways that the ways that we steward our sexuality. So I
Yes.
think, yeah, that can be true. But to me, the emphasis on God's grace was really healing for me. Like
Yes.
realizing that, I am married now and have 2 kids, like that they were gifts of grace from God, not something that I earned through my behavior or my choices.
Yeah.
And that even like my sexuality is a gift from God, and a responsibility to steward. It's not, I'm so great because I saved myself or something like that. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just when you really wrap your mind around God's grace, it takes away that pride, because it's, the Bible says like it's not based on works, so no one can
Right.
boast.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I thought that was so good. And I'm glad that you brought up just now like sexuality because I loved that in your singleness chapter, you talked about ways that they could also experience sexuality. Because I think we often like say that, you have to be married to have some kind of like to be a sexual being. But there's so much more to it than that, like sensualness of being like a person, and I just love that you mentioned some of those things in the singleness chapter because I think they're often forgotten about in this area, and that's not fair, especially if you're, so many. I just feel like I hear constantly single women and I mean, sure this was have been the case for a while, but I just feel like I hear all the time like more and more women are getting older, like not old by any means, but getting older and not finding a partner. And so they're just really struggling with that because I feel like I have a couple friends. It's like all the guys on the apps. It's like terrible. They're always like say this one thing and then they're asking you for like a nude pic or something or saying something
Yes.
really strange. Like the things that I've seen, especially some of these Christian apps, is
I know.
wild,
I know. It's
wild.
really sad.
Yeah. And I know that you talked about that being like an older single in your book. And so I just thought that was like a really good thing that you brought that up and talked to them about it so they just don't feel left behind.
Yeah, because I didn't want single people to be left out, because
Right.
often they are in conversations about sexuality, as if that's something that, again, we just flip on like a light switch once we get married.
Right.
I wanted to acknowledge that our sexuality is a part of us from birth, not that babies are sexual, that we should
Right.
sexualize them, but just that
Right.
like the capacity for connection and the desire for human connection and attachment is there from birth.
Totally.
And you don't just debut. There's this term sexual debut that's used in the research, meaning the first time you have intercourse. You don't
Mm-hmm.
debut as a sexual being on your wedding night or whenever you first have
Right.
intercourse. Like,
Right.
you debut on your birthday, is what I say, what I
Yep.
argue. So, yeah, so
Yeah.
I wanted people who are single to really claim and own their sexuality, but then you can choose how to steward it. You can
Mm-hmm.
choose what to do with it in a way that honors your values and your faith in God. And that may look like abstaining from intercourse
Yeah.
for some people, and but that doesn't mean you have to turn off your sexuality or suppress it, because that's
Right.
part of what got us into trouble with purity culture is you can't flip the switch when you've
Right.
suppressed it for so long.
Totally. Totally. I wanted to read one of your quotes from the damaged goods chapter because my mouth dropped open. I did not see this comment on Twitter, but man, I wish I would have because I probably would have had some thoughts. You said the rhetoric of the damaged good myth continues today. As I was writing this chapter, a host of a podcast on quote biblical masculinity with 20,000 followers on X called college women who have casual sex quote well used mattresses. I don't know about you, but for me, it's hard to imagine that this is what Jesus wrote in the sand when talking to a woman about her sexual sins. And my mouth dropped. I mean, I think when I was reading, I was literally out loud. I was like, "Yes, that is absolutely not what Jesus wrote in the sand when he was talking to this woman about her sins." Like that is just so crazy, and just goes to show that this stuff is still so live and well today. Like I don't know why it surprises me that people still do this stuff today. I think because I'm so in it every day that I feel like
Yeah.
I do see people are changing their minds, changing the conversations, the comments are changing, but then I see something like this and it's like absolutely not. But or then I also see a reel that I have that's kind of going viral right now and people are being horrible and saying very similar things. And so I guess I'm not surprised, but I shouldn't be surprised to say the less. But the well-used mattresses, that is so wild. 'Cause I'm like, what would you say about the men who were the ones having sex with the girls? What are you saying about that?
Yeah, good point.
Are
Yeah.
you saying anything to them? Are they
They're
well-used mattresses? Not that the girl is. I'm just saying, are
no
they
one is.
well-used
Yeah.
mattresses? You know, like you're not maing any comments about the guys,
Yeah, it's
which is
very double
horrible.
standard from somebody who talks about biblical masculinity.
Right.
But yeah, I think you do still see purity culture, and my Instagram followers will send me things when they see it, like send me
Yeah.
videos, send me posts,
Yeah.
like, oh, this is purity culture 2.0. You know, this is the
Yes.
new version
The
of
new
it. That it's,
version.
you know,
Yes.
maybe we're not doing those awful demonstrations like spitting into a cup of water and passing it around,
Right.
and that's the demonstration of premarital sex. But
Yes.
someone's still saying well used mattresses, or someone is still like making sex about him. You know, just
Yes.
stand where he tells you to stand, ladies. It's his
Right.
night. Just wear what he
Oh,
wants you to wear. Like you,
that made my skin crawl. I
yeah.
don't think I could I remember seeing that quote from that pastor who said like
Mm-hmm.
just stand where you want to say. I don't think I ever posted anything about it because I'll be honest, I couldn't find a Christ-like thing to say. I was like, anything that comes out of my mouth is not going to be Christ-like. And if I'm going to critique, I need to do it in a way that honors Christ. And none of the thoughts I have about this honor
Well, I
Christ.
just call it out, you know,
Yes. No,
and I
you
will
you handle stuff like this so well.
I
Truly,
will
I very
post
much
about
admire that
it
about you.
because, yeah, you just got to call it out and call it what it is and say, you're meaning
Totally.
this as a joke. I get that. And what you are saying is that she is an object on her wedding night. She is a
Yes.
passive recipient, not an active participant in her own
Yep.
sexual activity and sex life. And that
Yep.
it's all about him. This is the
Right.
gatekeeper's myth. So
Absolutely.
I'll just call it out and label it what it is and
Right.
the implications of it, because
Right.
this pastor's making a joke and he thinks it's funny, but as a psychologist, I'm seeing the
Right.
implications of this
Oh
and
yeah,
what this is
jokes
going
aren't
to lead
funny.
to.
It's like the Taylor Swift song, "Who's Afraid of Little Old Me." She says like they all made a joke and I went and cried, or so, I can't remember the exact word, but it was something like that. It's like you're gonna joke and I'm gonna go cry about it. That's like yes, because it's not funny. Like your jokes aren't funny. They're extremely harmful and they have so many more implications than what you think just by making one comment. My thought is always if you're willing to say that from a platform, what are you saying behind closed doors? Like if you're willing to make that joke on stage in front of so many people, I don't even want to imagine what you would say when nobody's listening. Like,
Yeah.
I'm
Or how
sure it's
they treat
bad.
their wives.
Yep, exactly. Or how they treat their wives. That's so true. I want to talk a little bit about the soul ties section in your book because I will be honest, this is a topic in my mind that I've always kind of struggled to wrap my brain around because I have heard about soul ties. I think I did like a a study one time in church where we like talked about breaking the soul ties and like the, letting all of that go, and we did a whole thing. But I've always struggled because I do see the bond that I have with my husband when we have sex.
Hmm.
Once I started having sex with my husband, I was like, I can see why God created this for marriage because it is so connecting, it's so bonding, it's so vulnerable. Like you do have that connection with people. So I had always like struggled mentally with that of like, because there is such a bond, like, is this, our soul ties a thing? Are they not? And I had just, there's a lot of nuance in my mind about this
Hmm.
topic. And I was always kind of afraid to talk about it because I didn't want people to think that I'm like trying to shame them or say that it's just
Hmm.
like so
Yeah.
much nuance, because I'm not trying to shame anybody or talk about, if you've been abused, you're with that person forever. Because
Yeah.
that's also
Yeah.
in my brain. I'm like, that doesn't make sense in my mind
Yeah, that's not
either.
true. Hmm.
Yeah, that's not true. So this was just a topic that I just personally have always kind of struggled with.
Hmm.
And the way that you wrote about it in your book really helped me gain, like, understand, like, when you said, like, oh, aren't our souls tied to God? I don't know why that was like the first time that clicked for me.
Mm.
Maybe it should have clicked a lot sooner, and I'll just be honest about that. But it just clicked to me when you said, like, as Christians, don't our souls belong to God and He can like make us new? And I'm like, yes, like our souls belonging to God. And that's everything I talk about with damaged goods when I say, like, yeah, Jesus can make you whole. I don't know why in my mind I couldn't make the jump to like, oh, Jesus can also make you whole in that way. I don't know why it never
Hmm.
clicked for me viewing it the soul ties way, but all of that to say, I'm really glad you talked about this because this is a really big part of purity culture, and just you talking about our souls belonging to God, that just you saying it in that way for some reason was like, oh, duh, not,
Yeah.
it just kind of
Yeah.
clicked for me a little bit in that way.
Well, I'm glad that helped you make more sense of it. It sounds like
Yeah.
this was just something you wrestled with and we're just not sure what you really believed about it, and it helped
Yeah.
you gain a little bit more clarity. Yeah, because I agree with you, Hannah, that sex is very bonding. It's, there's a lot of, it's a one flesh union, and it can
Hmm.
have like powerful connection and attachment effects through the release
Hmm.
of oxytocin. I think that's how God intended it to be, which is part of why I feel like, He asks us to have sex only in marriage with our spouse,
Hmm.
this person who we've made a covenant with, we've made
Yeah.
this lifelong commitment to. But for those that didn't do it, it doesn't mean that you're tied forever and eternally to these other people. The
Right.
way I think of it is like the Bible supports, and I think God's heart for sex is that it is a holistic mind, body, heart, and soul
Hmm.
connection.
Yeah.
But if you're not married to that person, I think you're limited in that mind, body, heart, and soul connection. Like,
Hmm.
you're not, because you haven't made that covenant with them, like you're limited in being able to share that soul connection with them. So I
Yeah.
think you're not giving them your soul. You're not really even sharing the fullness of yourself.
Right.
And I think even in marriage, that can be true too. So I,
Yeah,
I don't know that just because you're married, it's always a mind, body, heart, and soul connection either, or
for sure.
it's not always a connecting experience for some people.
Yeah.
But it has the potential to be when you're married, and I think that's God's heart for sex, and what He wants for us is for it to
Yeah.
be that holistic experience.
Totally. No, I loved everything. Like when you were writing about that, it just clicked so much for me, which I'm really excited to see what other people, when they're reading your book, like what
Yeah.
parts of it like clicked for them. I mean, there was so many other things, but that was a really big thing when I was reading it. And I was like,
Hmm.
oh, I'm so glad that Soul Ties is a part of this because personally, like I said, just the physicalness of it is where I think I was hitting a wall of like, but it is like physically connecting and there is the oxytocin. It's like, what does
Hmm.
that mean? Just kind of, can't really have nuance anymore these days, but we very much
We do.
celebrate the nuance, which which I just love because I think
Hmm.
we should have so much nuance and not things aren't black and white like
Hmm.
people like to say they are. Which, speaking of, I loved your thoughts and your writing on modesty,
Hmm.
because I don't know how you have felt in this space, but there have been times where I have felt like I've had to kind of watch my words because I don't want to be a purity culture 2.0, because I do believe that our clothes matter. Like I don't think that we should just walk around pretty much naked all the time,
Hmm.
because I do think they're a representation of ourselves and of Christ. Like if you claim Christ, that is a representation of it. But I loved how you talked about modesty and that, it is an intention of the heart, and that's what matters, that it's a heart intention. But you did talk about how your clothes, I can't remember, I didn't write this one down. I just remember, so I don't remember the exact quote, but you had said something about how it's like a reflection of God, I think is what you were saying.
Yes, so I said, what you wear is also about respect, self respect, and respect for others and other cultures. I want my children to dress in a way that respects their bodies as a gift from God. Yes, modesty is a biblical virtue, but it is about more than how clothing covers your body. A modest spirit that respects self and others is the goal to strive for.
Yes. Yes. I think that just perfectly encompasses like our, my thoughts on modesty as being not being about our clothes, and like if you just because you're in a bikini doesn't mean that you're being immodest, but you can use your clothes as a reflection of that, of Christ and how you are and stuff. And so I just thought you perfectly worded all of those like thoughts and beliefs about how modesty can be about clothes, but it's not all about clothes. It is about your heart and your intentions. I just felt like that was a really good way to describe it and not be, I don't know, I've caught myself trying not to slide into the purity culture 2.0 thoughts with modesty, because I don't necessarily believe it that way, but just the way you were talked about it, I thought was a really healthy view of modesty.
Yeah, because like you said, that's a nuanced topic too. Like we don't want to say, wear whatever you want. Who cares what other people think? Like that's really not realistic.
Right.
When I go to a job interview, I do care what other people think, and I wear
Absolutely.
and dress in a way that reflects that.
Totally.
But we don't want to go back to purity culture 2.0 of you have to think about constantly be thinking about, especially what men are going to be thinking about you and dress for them,
Right.
So it's,
Right.
I guess it's a difference of I'm dressing to please or approve, what others think, or on the other hand, to entice others or to get their attention
Right.
versus I'm dressing in a way that feels good to me, that respects myself and feels like it honors my body and honors God.
Right, absolutely. I know that as I've just gotten older, and I still struggle with this sometimes of like trying to wear clothes that fit my body, because my husband will always say this, like I always buy one size too big of like t-shirts, and it's because I was just always like, but my boobs look too big, even when I'm like breastfeeding or not breastfeeding. Even if when I was breastfeeding and my boobs were just so much larger than they are now, I would be so subconscious about like wearing a tight shirt, and it's not even a tight shirt, just a shirt that fit me. But because it made my boobs look a certain way, I was like, oh, they're gonna think I'm trying to do this, but that's not the case. I'm just trying to honor my body now and actually wear clothes that fit me versus trying to hide. Because I would use the larger size clothes to hide my body because I was so afraid of what others were thinking about it, and the not wanting to, be immodest way, and not wanting to cause others to stumble. And it was just a real mental thing that I've still worked through today, is like, okay, I can wear a fitted shirt. That doesn't mean that I'm trying to do something. Because my intention is just to wear a shirt that fits me. Like it's not that deep. Like I'm just trying to wear a shirt that fits me as
Yeah,
long as that is too big.
I was just
You
thinking
know?
like today I'm wearing jeans and I was just thinking like I don't think Jesus cares that much about my jeans, like what
No.
jeans I wear or what they look
Right.
like or what style they are. Um,
Totally.
I think but I feel like what I'm wearing, I feel like what I wear reflects like who I am and how I want to present myself to the world. And
Absolutely.
you can't hide we're women, we can't hide that we have breasts, and
Right.
some of us have larger ones than others, and you just can't
Yep.
hide that to some extent.
Totally.
um and
And
that's
you
part of
didn't necessarily
accepting
have
our
to.
body.
Yes, absolutely. And just being comfortable in your body in the way that God made it. And like thanking God for that. I've tried really hard to do that. I'm like, thank you, Lord, for giving me the boobs that I have that were for feeding my son for 16 months. And now that they're not, but just
Oh,
thank you for like giving me, the body to be able to do this, and just to like have boobs. I'm grateful for that's my body. Like I've really tried to like work on the gratefulness of it. That's kind of helped me overcome the shame piece, is like being grateful.
I love that. And also appreciating what my body does for me rather than how it looks. That's been helpful for
Yes.
me of like you said with breastfeeding, or just that my body can walk and sit and stand and
Yes.
move around with minimal pain at this point, at this age,
Yes.
and I'm very thankful for that. Yeah,
Absolutely.
just the ways that my body works and that God makes my body work that I don't even have to think about. And
Totally.
so there's so much to appreciate about our bodies.
Absolutely. Breaking your leg will really help you be grateful to be able to walk. I will tell you that.
Yeah.
I try to take that, never take that for granted again, that I can. There's been times like on Sundays, our pastor, whenever we are reading scripture, he will say, if you are if you're physically able to, can you stand while
Yeah.
we read the Bible? And I just love that. It's like a respect, you know. And sometimes I'm like lazy and tired. I'm like, I don't want to stand up, but I'm like, no. There were times where I couldn't stand, and I had to sit because I didn't have the I genuinely could not stand. And so I'm like, nope, I can stand. Number one, I don't need to be lazy, and I can respect God's word. But like, I can physically stand now. That's so exciting. I should do it. So it's definitely a way to be grateful for that.
Yeah, good.
Anyways, I also wanted to talk about the parts of your book where you talk about deconstruction. I think deconstruction has a very negative, I would say, association with it. I don't think it's negative, but I just think in the spaces I've been in and hearing pastors talking and everything, they're like, "Oh, she's deconstructing. That's so bad." But I think it's such an important part of overcoming purity culture is deconstructing those views and hopefully reconstructing them is an ongoing process, but reconstructing them, to reconstruct, you have to deconstruct. So I love that you talked about that in your book. And so you said that it's like a healthy process, which I completely agree with. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I define deconstruction as just the process of rethinking your beliefs to figure out what is truth and what was lie, what was incorrectly given to you. And
Yes.
I think we do this process throughout our life in so many different ways. Whether it's like I don't know, just like realizing the world is bigger than we thought, or
Yeah.
realizing that our schemas, like our mental frameworks for the way that we view the world, just don't match every situation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like one example, like my daughter's 5, and she said something about one of our neighbors, like, "Oh, I wonder where they go to church on Sunday." And I was like, "You know what? I don't. They might not go to church." And she was like, "Oh, you know, like that was like a
Yeah.
new. Oh,
A
not
new thought
everybody
for her.
goes to church, or
Right,
even
right,
like not everybody goes to school. Like some
right.
people are homeschooled or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
So just even a neutral example like that, you're able to see like gaining new information helps you make sense of your previous beliefs and your
Mm-hmm.
previous assumptions. And that
Yeah.
is a normal and healthy process that we do throughout our lives as we grow and mature. And especially as our thinking abilities mature from concrete thinking to abstract thinking.
Mm-hmm.
There's the gray, there's the nuance versus
Yeah.
concrete is the black and white. And that kind of thinking is really not encouraged often when you grow
Mm-hmm.
up in more traditional and conservative religion and in purity
Totally.
culture.
Yeah.
But it's a healthy part of development. And you know, my big mission is to help people heal their faith from toxic beliefs. That you
Mm-hmm.
can come through this process of deconstruction, maintaining your faith, maintaining your identity as a Christian with a stronger, deeper, and more nuanced faith in the end.
Yes.
This doesn't have to mean deconverting and
Right. Which I think a lot of people associate that as like, okay, if you're deconstruct, that means that you are leaving the faith. And
yeah,
it's
because
like,
we
that's
have a
not
lot of
always the
high
case.
profile examples of that.
Yes,
We see
absolutely.
Christian celebrities who've done that and it makes the
Totally.
headlines, but most people or many people
Yeah,
deconstruct and their faith just looks different and may have some different beliefs, but they still are Christian or they still would claim to be Christ followers.
totally.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to look like that.
Absolutely. I know for a long time I had a very, just even outside of purity culture, very legalistic view of God, and like there was a lot of rights and you couldn't do this, and there was like not a lot of room for grace. And so I had to like deconstruct that part to see God as not just like all the legalism and that there is so much grace and stuff. And that was just like one way that I deconstructed and reconstructed. And I did a lot of that also with purity culture, but you know, so many Christians do that, and like you said, you just don't hear about it. You don't see it, but there are so many who like go through that. And I think it has made me so much stronger in my relationship with Jesus because I took the time to like really figure out those thoughts about things and purity culture and, like I said, legalism part, and kind of found so much more of a deeper connection with God. And he's not afraid of that. I mean, there was literally a disciple who was named Doubting Thomas, you know, and he was a disciple and God loved him. So it's like there's so much room and space to have those questions. And just because you have those questions doesn't have any negative meaning with it. It's okay to ask those things. I'm like, God is definitely big enough to take my little questions that I have, you know?
Yeah, that God honors those questions and that process, and He meets us there in it. Like, we don't have to say goodbye to Him as we do this deconstruction process, like, we can do it with Him.
Totally. So the last thing I want to talk about is sexual ethic. I personally have found myself where when I started talking about sex, I kind of felt myself very much in the middle. I was like, I believe that there is like a positive way that we can view sex without being, quote, like too sex positive because I don't think that you should personally, have sex with whoever you want, whenever you want, all the things about it. But I also don't want to be in the so like purity culture mindset around it. I don't think that's healthy. And a lot of people coming out of purity culture have been like kind of more to the sex positive mindset, I would say, like the extreme
Mm-hmm.
sex positive mindset.
Mm-hmm.
How can we like find a middle path forward with like finding our own sexual ethic if some of us feel kind of in the middle with this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll talk to people who are Christians who claim to love and follow Christ because I think it's going to look different for us than it will for somebody who has deconstructed out of Christianity.
Yes,
Um,
100%.
so in the book, I contrast this ethic of shame, which is purity culture, this sexual ethic that's based on shame, with an ethic of consent. And this is what the world is really preaching right now, and even what some Christians are preaching. And by that I mean an ethic, like a sexual ethic solely based on consent. That as long
Right.
as it's consensual, it's legal, you can go for it. And that's what it's kind of saying with sex positivity. Like every sexual act, as long as it's consensual, is positive.
Yeah.
And for Christians, I really think that's a very shallow and short-sighted way to view sex too. I think that really misses God's heart for sex, even for people who no longer believe in like premarital abstinence. Like they may, still believe that you can have sex outside of marriage and that can be good. There's still so much more to sex than just consent, just as long as it's
Totally.
legal. Like there's
Right.
so much more to consider. And I wanted to challenge and kind of push people to consider what else is there, what else is important besides it's legal. And so I call the middle path a values congruent ethic, meaning you figure out what your values and beliefs are about sex, and this can be rooted in your theology, rooted in your experience, your reasoning, your conversations in community. So you figure out what your values and beliefs are, and then you make choices congruent with those values.
Yes.
That is a way to
So
move
good.
forward from shame too. Shame is not resolved by just like throwing off this ethic of shame for sex positivity, quote.
Right.
Like that, and that's what the world tells us. Like
Absolutely.
just liberate yourself from all of the limits and all of the boundaries,
Yeah.
and then you'll be free from shame. You'll be shameless, and that
Yeah.
that is really not the case. If you don't do the work of clarifying what your beliefs and values are, you're in danger of making choices that
Yeah.
you will have guilt and shame about.
Totally. Totally. I was just watching Love is Blind. I don't know if you watch Love is Blind. I love some reality TV. It's like my trash reality TV.
Yes.
And one of the girls on there, she was talking with her fiance about sex, and she was saying, and I think that they have said like that they believe in God, but I can't remember if no, I don't think that they like strongly follow. I think they're just like, oh yeah, we believe in God, whatever. But she was talking about her belief around sex, and she was like, it's not based off like a religious view of sex. I have decided like I've done the whole like have sex with whoever you want whenever you want, and that just doesn't sit right with me anymore. Like I do believe in like now being abstinent until I am married because I want that connection to be with my spouse. Like it's not even for a religious reason. It's just because I've tried all that and that doesn't sit right with me. Like I want that deeper connection. And I thought that was such a cool conversation because a lot of times you just associate abstinence with Christianity. But I was like, okay, finally someone's talking about this, not just from like the Christian standpoint, but like, yeah, that it can be really, harmful to just kind of go out and do all of that with whoever you want, and that sounded really shamey, and that's not what I meant. I take that back. I didn't mean that to sound very shameful to others, and that's how that came out. See, I'm always trying to be better,
But there can be natural consequences, is what
yes,
I hear you
that's what I'm
saying.
saying. Yeah.
There can be natural consequences of waiting. You might not be as prepared for marriage, or
Right.
it may take you a little longer to figure things out.
Right.
And there can be natural consequences to not waiting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's fair to acknowledge those. But
Yeah.
along with what you were saying about even non-religious reasons to wait, I interviewed one woman who was widowed, and she's in her 40s now, and she was talking about figuring out her sexual ethic, and she said it's more than just her religion. Like she was honoring her needs for emotional vulnerability and safety. Like sex was something she didn't feel comfortable doing without the safe context of a healthy marriage. And
Yes.
that was her deeper why. That was her, like a profound reason for her. But it was something she was choosing, not something that was put upon her.
Right.
And that's the distinction I make between purity culture and me still holding to a traditional sexual ethic is that this is now my choice, and this is now something I have done the work to reconstruct and figure out what I believe, and this is what I believe. This
Yeah,
is what I believe is good, true, and beautiful and God's heart for sex. But it's not
absolutely.
something that was handed to me and not something that I feel forced or coerced into out of shame and fear.
Right.
That was what purity culture was to me. So
Absolutely.
that's the distinction I make, because sometimes I'm on, various purity culture, groups on Facebook, and some of them are people who have very much left Christianity, very much left traditional Christian values, and they will say, "Well, if you tell people that sex has to be within marriage, that's just purity culture." And I'm like, "It's not, because it's
No,
it's my deeply held belief that I have done the work to reconstruct. It's
absolutely.
what I value and what I believe is good and true. And so that's
Absolutely.
not purity culture. I'm not doing
No.
it because I'm going to be damaged Rose if I have sex, or
Right.
because I need to give my husband sex every 72 hours to meet his needs.
Right.
Like
Right.
it's not because of that. It's because of
Yeah.
my deeply held values.
Totally. Totally. Oh, I did want to bring this one thing up because you said the 7 shower rule, which made me think it's so interesting how when I was talking about, I've always talked about purity culture, but when my husband and I were going through his like porn addiction, we were given the Every Man's Battle books, and I was given the wife's version of it. And I have like memories during that time of like me reading that book somehow like in a way helped me, and I looked and Thomas would he read about half of it, and I think at the time he was too scared to tell me that it wasn't helpful because I think he didn't want me to think that like he wasn't like taking it to heart or whatever. But since and he did say some of it was helpful, but he's like, I didn't really necessarily like tell you that it wasn't helpful and that it was more
Hmm.
harmful. He's like, I didn't feel right reading, but also probably, I honestly, he was probably scared of me just being like, well, you're not taking this seriously, whatever. And it's just so interesting because now I've looked back at some of those books and I'm like, I told other people to read them, and that's like
Hmm.
so bad.
Yeah,
But I'm
I
like,
did
two things can
too.
be true. Like some, I can get like one helpful thing out of it, two things can be true. Like there can be something helpful, and but it be overly harmful. But I was just, you had a couple quotes in your books, and I was like, yeah, I can't believe I like told other people to read those books. But it's just,
Well, they
and
were
this
the
was
books
like
I read too.
not too long ago. I mean, it was right after we got married, so I was still very early into like working through all of this stuff. But I'm like, I definitely told people like old podcasts you could hear me talking about. It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah. Well, we learn and grow, and that's
Totally.
that's our beliefs are, and faith is always evolving and with
Yes.
with new information, and that shows the
Absolutely.
humility too of like, I wish I hadn't said that, or I wish I hadn't recommended that book, or I
Right.
regret judging others, and yeah, and that's part
Totally.
of evolving too.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Your book was so good. There were so many good things. I feel like we could have talked for hours about it. But where can people buy the book? Because it is out now, so like you can get it. So where can people buy it, and where can people also, after they buy it and love it so much, leave you a review? Because I know that like
Thank
reviews
you.
are so important to this
Thank
process.
you. Oh, that's sweet of you. Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, so the book is Recovering from Purity Culture. It was out October 15th. It's available wherever books are sold. Amazon, Baker Book House, that's my publisher. They always give a really good deal.
Nice.
And my website's drcamden.com if you want to check out my work. And I'm on all the socials at Dr. Camden. So you can follow me if you're interested in learning more. And as far as leaving a review, Amazon is always great, Goodreads, any of the retailers that you bought the book at. But yeah, I'd really appreciate hearing comments. People have already been leaving a couple reviews, and my launch team has had good feedback, and so that's been really great to read. And just this has been, a largely like solo, isolated
Hmm.
kind of project over the
Yeah.
last couple of years, because you're just writing and typing, and just it's all in
Right.
your head. And so like to see it now coming out and hearing people read it, and just
Hmm.
that's really gives me a lot of gratitude. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Oh, of course. I'm just so happy that these books are now here, and I'm hoping that they can replace all of the really harmful ones that we have read, and that people will see this is the good, the goodness
Hmm.
of it. of like overcoming purity culture and not living in that place anymore. So thank you just again for writing the book. And I will link all of that in the episode notes so you can very easily click on the Amazon link, and I'll link her social medias as well. But thank you so much for being on the podcast. I love just chatting with you as well. We could talk about
Yes.
stuff like this literally all day long. So,
Yes, you're always so fun to talk to. And thank you again for contributing to the book with your story.
oh, yes, thank you for having me. Okay, friends, that is our episode today. Thanks so much for hanging out with us, and we will talk soon.